Cool.
I'm going to go ahead and just start on some introductions. So thank you everyone for coming this evening. I'm Angelica Diggs, so I'm the Executive Director of the Montclair History Center. Thank you so much for joining tonight's History at Home presentation. We're really excited to have Lisanne Renner, who's here tonight, giving this presentation on the history and 110th birthday this year of the Bellevue Avenue Library branch. So I'm really excited to see what we're going to uncover. Lisanne is a founding member of Friends of Anderson Park and the historian for that conservancy. Lisanne has given presentations and partners with us on walking tours. So we're really thrilled to have her back this evening to share more about this gem in Upper Montclair. So thank you for doing this. I said this about 3 times, so just a little bit of housekeeping. If you're more than 2 people or more than 20 miles away, feel free to put that in the chat. I also want to give credit to the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, a state partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities, for their funding of tonight's program, making it free and accessible. Feel free to use the chat. We're going to just ask that you stay on mute during the presentation, but then we'll do a live Q&A at the end. We can do any questions that came up in the chat, but also you can feel free to unmute at the end as well. So thank you for attending tonight. We will record it and we'll put it up on our YouTube channel afterwards this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it on over to Lisanne and we'll get started. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Angelica. I'm really happy to be here. I love talking about the Bellevue Avenue Branch Library. It's one of my favorite buildings in Upper Montclair. Just a brief little introduction on the building itself. It is a branch library, so it's a subset, a branch of the main Montclair Public Library. And so this story is going to tell you about how it got to be there and why. So the library opened in 1914, 110 years ago this year, and it opened during a surge in development and beautification that happened in Montclair between the 1880s and the 1930s. It was a period when significant cultural institutions were established, such as the Montclair Art Museum, and many vernacular wood frame buildings would be replaced by more architecturally ambitious masonry buildings like this one. Okay, hold on a second. So I want to give you a sense of what Upper Montclair was like at the time that this building was being considered and ultimately built. So this is Bellevue Avenue looking eastward, and just try to visualize what Upper Montclair was like more than a century ago. It had a population of about 7,000 people, and those people largely took horses, carriages, bicycles, and shoe leather to venture wherever they wanted to go. So if you lived in Upper Montclair and you wanted to go to the public library, you would have to go downtown, and it wouldn't be a quick trip in the car. This is Bellevue Avenue looking westward toward the mountain and the railroad tracks. This building right here has since been replaced by the Brick Bank building at the corner of Valley Road and Bellevue. So just this gives you a sense of what things were looking like in Upper Montclair. These are some of the significant buildings that were built during that time period that I told you about. So a branch library would really be an amenity to Upper Montclair, and it would also make Upper Montclair more attractive from a real estate perspective. And additionally, it was a civic shot in the arm. And around the turn of the century, you could count on one hand the number of architect-designed masonry buildings in Upper Montclair. These are a few of them. A few more you'll be familiar with still today are the Union Kong Church, St. James Episcopal Church, the Upper Montclair Fire Department, and this building on the right, which was the post office, and on the left was the Fox Dry Goods store. And so now we're bringing you to the petition that was filed in 1904. And if you look at the date way up in the corner, you'll see it's May 17th, 1904. So as of tomorrow, that's exactly 120 years ago, when there was a push to request that this branch library be built. So as early as 1898, there was a committee that was looking into opening an Upper Montclair branch library, but it would take 16 years before the Bellevue branch actually opened. And people were getting rather impatient, which is why they signed on to this petition asking that the branch library be built. So in 1904, several dozen residents signed this petition calling for a branch library. And they did this 1 month after the town opened its first Carnegie Library. So this was the second Carnegie Library in Upper Montclair, but there was already a first one that opened at the corner of Church Street and Valley Road. And this is what it looked like. You'll now know it as the Unitarian Church. So this was not the first library to open in Upper Montclair. There was an earlier library physical building, but this was the first Carnegie Library to be built. And Montclair is rather unusual in that it has two Carnegie libraries. So after this 1904 petition, Upper Montclair would have 3 temporary Upper Montclair branch locations before settling into its current home on Bellevue Avenue. So that first branch library, this temporary location, which opened in January of 1899 and lasted until 1902, was really the real estate office of a man named John Mancini. And John is this firefighter right here. The bottom row, or excuse me, the front row, second from the left. He offered up his real estate office along Bellevue Avenue near the railroad tracks to be this temporary home for the library. And there are conflicting accounts over exactly which building his real estate office was in. I've never been able to nail that down. But it might have been inside this building, which was called the Trunk Building. And this building sat where the Bellevue Theater now stands. So it could have been there. It could have also been in this building right here in the far left of the photo where it says real estate and insurance. This is along Bellevue Avenue, just directly east of the train tracks, which you can see right here. And this stretch of buildings is now roughly where the Bellevue parking plaza is. So that's one of the other tentative locations for where this was. Teenage girls volunteered to run the operation, and there was a butcher who had shops in both parts of town, and he shuttled books back and forth between downtown Montclair and Upper Montclair while making his butcher rounds. Now, during this time, when the Bellevue Branch Library opened around 1914, one of the most popular books with library patrons was this one, When Knighthood Was in Flower. At that time, in 1914, when the library opened, the branch had just 200 books, compared with the almost 16,000 items that the branch library has now. One of the other temporary locations of the branch library before the one we all know now opened was in this spot here at the southeast corner of Valley Road in Lorraine. Now, it was where this building now stands, but there was a different building there now. This building was not the one that the library was in, but just the spot was where one of those temporary locations was. And of one of those temporary locations, again, we don't know which one exactly it was, but this is what the library looked like on its interior. So it gives you a sense of how things have changed. Now, a little bit about who Andrew Carnegie was. He was his foundation donated money to build the library, not just in Montclair, but all over the country. He was a Scottish immigrant who came to Allegheny, Pennsylvania in 1848 with his destitute family. And in 1935, the Carnegie Corporation sent copies of this particular portrait to all Carnegie libraries, and one is still hanging in the Bellevue branch. This is the Weaver's Cottage, where Andrew Carnegie was born in Scotland. As I mentioned, his family was destitute when they came to the United States, but Andrew Carnegie ultimately became a fabulously wealthy industrialist, a steel baron, and one of the most high-profile philanthropists of his era. He wrote a book in 1889 titled The Gospel of Wealth, which urged the rich to use their money to better society. And that spurred a wave of philanthropy. Of course, you all know Carnegie Hall. That was one of his contributions too. This is Carnegie again, of course. In his youth, he was a telegraph messenger in Pittsburgh and took advantage of the generosity of a man named Colonel James Anderson, who shared his private library with what he called working boys. This ability to use this man's library opened up the intellectual world for Carnegie and planted the seed for his future philanthropy. His Carnegie Library, the very first one that he built, was in his hometown of Dunfermline. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, in Scotland, which opened in 1883. That was followed by two Pennsylvania libraries, and that was the state where he had his steel operations. But eventually, he would fund about 1,600 libraries in about 1,400 communities in 47 states. And by 1908, he stopped funding large central libraries and focused on building branch libraries that he felt brought books closer to the homes of the people. He saw branch libraries as a way to facilitate upward mobility among immigrants and the working class, and as a way to create a more disciplined workforce and a more educated workforce. Now, although he was appreciated for his philanthropy, he was also reviled by some for the way he treated labor in his factories. There was a violent strike in 1892 at one of his steel mills, which lasted for 143 days in 1892, which included deaths and injuries. Labor lost that fight, but Carnegie's reputation was stained forever. And some communities have rejected the opportunity for a grant library, viewing the money as tainted. For example, Patterson, just up the road from us, its library was destroyed by fire in 1902. It's a very heavily manufacturing-oriented city at the time, and they rejected Carnegie's offer to build a new library because they didn't want to take money from him. There are also cynics who saw the library funding program as just a way for Carnegie to burnish his image. Now let's talk a little bit about what's called the free library movement. It's very proudly proclaimed on the frieze here of the Montclair branch. In the second half of the 19th century, reformers began to view libraries as instrumental in addressing some of the ills of a rapidly industrializing nation. Libraries they saw as providing civic betterment, moral uplift, cultural enlightenment, and personal improvement. Libraries could teach immigrants how to succeed in America and lift up the poor through knowledge. Libraries were also viewed as wholesome alternatives to the saloon and the gambling parlor. So the free library movement aimed to make libraries accessible to everyone. And before then, people used libraries by subscription. So you had to pay a monthly or an annual fee to be able to access a library. Obviously not good if you didn't have much money. In Montclair in 1869, Israel Crane joined with 30 other families to form a subscription library in the Crane's front parlor, with members paying an annual fee of what would be today roughly about $70. Then along came the Munn Library. This was a former tavern that later came to house the main library in Montclair downtown. Then in 1890, the state passed legislation allowing towns to establish free public libraries and levy a tax to fund those libraries. So by 1893, Montclair had chartered its library, its first library. So this is an architect's rendering of the branch library. And as you see again, the word free is right there in its name. Very proudly part of that. Now, talk about how Montclair got two Carnegie libraries. So, as I mentioned earlier, this was the first Carnegie Library right here in downtown Montclair. And the township got $40,000 from the Carnegie Library, excuse me, the Carnegie Foundation in 1902 to open this library in 1904. So at the time, that was the main library for the township of Montclair, the first Carnegie Library. This is its interior. This is another exterior photo of it where it mentions Andrew Carnegie's generosity. And this is a man named William Power. So several years before the library received its second Carnegie grant, it was hatching plans for building an Upper Montclair branch. On Christmas Eve, 1907, the township bought its current site for the Bellevue branch, which was then a vacant lot, from this man, William Power, who was a major landowner in town. Carnegie Corporation's practice was to build and equip libraries, but local governments had to provide the site, the property, and a budget for operating and maintaining those libraries once they were built. One of the reasons this particular piece of property was chosen for the Bellevue branch was because it was on a corner lot. And a corner lot is advantageous because the building gets more light in its windows. It was also on a major thoroughfare, that being Bellevue Avenue. And it was in a transition zone between commercial and residential. And there was room at the back that would allow for expansion if that time should ever come. Now, it was not unheard of for a town to receive two Carnegie libraries, but it was unusual, especially for a small town like Montclair. So how did this happen? First of all, Montclair had its ducks in a row when it approached Carnegie for the second application. It understood the process. It already had bought a site, and it was willing to pledge an annual appropriation for operation and maintenance, and it had the support of town officials. It also had a secret weapon, which was this man right here, the Reverend Henry Jackson. He was at the Union Congregational Church, but before he came to Montclair, he had jumped through the hoops already of applying for a Carnegie Library grant when he worked at a church in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania in 1906. And at that point, he was involved in Swarthmore College's construction of a Carnegie Library. So he knew the drill. He volunteered to make the case for Upper Montclair, personally filling out the application, even though he wasn't even a library trustee. So the Reverend Jackson, along with Howard Ayres, who was a leader of that 1904 petition you saw earlier, those two men managed to get a personal meeting with Carnegie himself at Carnegie's New York City mansion, this building here, in November 1912. And after that meeting, Jackson submitted a formal application. And Jackson wasn't apparently beloved that much in Montclair. There was one description of him that called him a, quote, practical man, rather aggressive and modern to a degree which shocked some of the church members. But he was very good at working the system to get this Carnegie Library for Upper Montclair. But there was a personality clash among some strong-willed people. And although he got the job done in Upper Montclair, he did leave town for another job just 1 year after the branch opened. This is a letter on Carnegie Corporation letterhead, saying that the corporation would give Montclair $20,000 for its Bellevue Branch Library. This is dated April 9th, 1913. Now, when the library trustees got this letter, instead of just saying great, they immediately made a case to get $10,000 more. But Carnegie's secretary wrote back basically saying, don't be greedy. He said the amount of $20,000 was not decided upon haphazard. The amount which was already been promised to Montclair, $60,000 in all, he's referring to the earlier Carnegie Library too, is 50% more than is ordinarily given to a community of its population. So Montclair did get a coup in getting the two libraries, both of them from Carnegie, even though they wanted to get a little more money the second time around. Let's talk a little bit about the architecture of this beautiful gem. Um, it's a neoclassical revival style. It's a real little jewel box of a building. The Carnegie Corporation actually campaigned against sort of grand ornate temple fronts and domes and other elaborate features, mainly on the grounds that they became expensive. But a lot of communities wanted that anyway, even though the Carnegie Library literature, the Carnegie Corporation literature encouraged, quote, a plain and dignified structure. The Carnegie people did not advocate for grand and expensive gestures. As I mentioned, no domes. They really didn't like domes. They didn't want big freestanding classical columns. And here you have attached pilaster columns. You have rusticated corners here. You've got decorative side lights around the door, transom windows above the door, an inscribed panel up here, which we'll talk about in a minute, and these sort of large granite steps leading up to this, what is really a temple front. This is the entrance, which you're probably all familiar with. And then the description or inscription above the roof says, "He that loveth a book will never want a faithful friend, a wholesome counselor, a cheerful companion, an effectual comforter," meaning if you have a book, you have everything you need, really. Now, this quote comes from Isaac Barrow, who was a 17th century philosopher and mathematician. And this same quote appears in a library built in Chicago before this library was built, which may be where the architect got the idea of including it. This is Isaac Barrow. This is one of the details that has been lost over time, this grill door. It's was one of the architectural elements that have vanished. It was deemed too heavy. You know, when people tried to open it, it was just too heavy, and it was removed, and no one really knows what happened to it. It's never been found. These are some architectural drawings, and it just gives you a sense of the elaborate classical detailing that went into this design. This is the cornice. You see the Corinthian style fluted pilasters are down below here. You have a classical dentiled cornice up here, and this frieze that wraps all the way around the building. One of the nice touches in the frieze is the open book. And here's a close-up of that open book. I also want to point out what are called Austral windows. Austral is a brand name. It's a type of window, and what makes it special is it lets in a lot of light for reading, but it's also got a patented device. It's a self-balancing window that eliminated sash weights, cords, and pulleys. And the advantage of it is the upper and lower sashes move simultaneously in opposite directions. So they allow fresh air to enter indirectly, and they vent out stale air at the top of the window. And when they're fully open, they provided 70% ventilation as compared to 50% ventilation for double hung windows. And this is really important in an era before air conditioning. And windows, of course, are extremely important in a library. They let in a lot of light for readership. The Montclair Township had the wisdom to restore these windows around between 2016 and 18. And it's a restoration that received a Brick and Mortar Award from the Township's Historic Preservation Commission. This is the architect of the library, Francis Augustus Nelson. He was in his mid-30s when he designed the library. He's probably a little younger than that in this photo. There was no architectural competition. The library trustees knew that they wanted Francis Nelson to design the building. He was a recently arrived Montclair resident, and he was in a New York City architectural partnership called Nelson and Van Wagenen. This was the very first public building for Montclair that Nelson did. He also did other buildings for Montclair later on, including the post office here, which is now Java Love, the Masonic Temple, which is now Williams-Sonoma, the Upper Montclair Women's Club. This is the gorgeous interior of that building. And he did the memorial tower here for St. James Church. He also did several grand homes in Montclair and one modest home for a piano teacher. And after a few years of designing the Montclair Branch Library, he also designed a library for Verona, which was also recently renovated just a few years ago. This is a floor plan for the Bellevue Library. It's an open floor plan with a large rectangular space with bookshelves lining the perimeter walls. Significantly, there's a centrally placed checkout desk, which allows for surveillance in the sense that right here at the desk, the librarian you can have just one librarian who's able to look out at the whole upper floor of the library and see what's going on. Down here in the basement level, there was a fumigator, and this was a little sort of closet-sized oven to sterilize books against contagious diseases such as infantile paralysis, scarlet fever, diphtheria, things like that. This would heat the shelves in this little closet to 170 degrees, and books would be placed in that chamber for 24 hours to be disinfected. Whether that worked or not, I have no idea, but that was definitely the intention. The library has lovely features like these vaulted ceilings. The Carnegie Foundation gave communities written what they called notes on the erection of library buildings, which had sort of a design suggestions. There were no things that you had to do, but they did give you suggestions and guidance. And there was a review process. You had to take your plan and run it past the foundation for approval. These written guidelines suggested floor plans, but they did not dictate any particular architectural style. But they did encourage the community and the architects to, quote, express their individuality. As I mentioned, it didn't try to influence style, but it simply called for, quote, good taste in building. And they called for efficient design and the practicality for the purpose at hand. Yeah, there is essentially, I think, a family resemblance among these Carnegie libraries. And maybe it was just because they were all built roughly around the same period. But, if you're in a town and you see a little library, you can kind of tell if it was a Carnegie library. They tended to have a main floor set atop a high base like the Bellevue Library does. They were generally symmetrical with a centrally placed entrance pavilion. And they often had details that emulated classical forms, often the temple front motif, which was very popular among these buildings. This one is in Bayonne, New Jersey. This one is in Petoskey, Michigan. This one is in Portland, Indiana. This one is in Syracuse, Indiana. So the designs reflect a conservative local expectation of how a library should look. And although the Carnegie Corporation allowed freedom in design, communities usually went with the tried and the true. These buildings were not known for being daring, experimental, or cutting edge architecture. They occasionally reflected local traditions, such as Spanish or Mediterranean, but they usually played it safe and conservative and reflected what the community wanted. This, however, is one in Riverside, California, which did reflect the Mediterranean style or the Spanish style. Now back to the Bellevue Library. This is the central circulation desk in the 1930s, with one librarian at that central desk who, as I mentioned earlier, can efficiently survey her entire domain from that one central desk. This is the library, probably around the 1930s. This shows you, again, that open floor plan where one librarian could manage the place. And there would be no full height partitions that would block the librarian's view. The concept was supposed to be very much like a foreman on a factory floor. So you would not need to have lots of librarians in different parts of the building. You could just have one, maybe two librarians who could scope out everything from their one perch. This picture also shows you the large windows, which started about 6 feet above the floor so that there was room for bookshelves below the windows. And the windows all around would allow lots of light in. Is another sense of that. It shows you sort of the high level of detailing both on the exterior and on the interior, especially if you look up here above the front door entrance portico, you see this elaborate wooden crown with the pediment, a lot of detail there. Another significant thing was that readers were allowed to get their own books from the shelves along the walls. Unlike libraries in the past, you no longer needed to go to a librarian and have the librarian retrieve books from behind a desk. You had the power to get your own books. And so OpenStax gave patrons really an unprecedented power to access and browse books, and it demonstrated a level of trust. The libraries were no longer supposed to just be a storehouse of treasures. And when the Bellevue Library was built, the trustees decided that they were going to spend a little extra money to upgrade the type of bookcases that they were going to use quarter sawn oak, which has a more attractive grain. It costs a little more money, but you see here how these nice bookcases really make the wood shine through. And here's another example where you can see the quarter sawn oak has a really beautiful grain. Now, these are adjustable cast iron bookshelves, and they were new when the library was built, and they were state of the art at the time, and their adjustability made them very popular in libraries all across the country, including the Library of Congress. These original cast iron adjustable bookshelves are still in the north end of the Bellevue Library. This is the construction contract for the library. It was built, the contractor who was hired was a man named John Picken. You can see his signature there. He was a general contractor, and he would later become a Montclair Town Council member in 1933 and a township building inspector around 1940. And here he is, John Picken. Now, the Carnegie Libraries, the explosion of these construction of libraries around the country really gave a boost to women and gave them a more important role in the workforce. What the first librarian at the Bellevue branch was this woman, Bessie English. Although men may have physically built the Bellevue Library, it was run by women. And at the Montclair branch, Bessie English was the first paid librarian in 1906. So she was a librarian even before the branch that we now know was constructed. And then she was followed a year or so later by a librarian named Norma Wells. And before that, as I mentioned, it was just teenage girls who volunteered to operate the library in those temporary locations. A local women's club called the Wednesday Afternoon Club really should get the credit for establishing the first free public library in Montclair in 1893, along with Israel Crane's effort. And these women were the engines behind the genesis of libraries throughout the nation, but men were the driving force in creating the Bellevue branch. Here are some librarians at work. These pictures here are probably taken at the main branch of the library in around early 1930s. Until the turn of the 19th century, men dominated the librarian profession, but by the early 1920s, it was becoming a more acceptable field for women and one of the few available to them, along with teaching and nursing. And the Carnegie Libraries really opened up a lot of job positions for women at these new libraries that didn't exist before. His philanthropy essentially augmented the conditions that supported the entry of women into librarianship by amplifying the demand for qualified staff. And these women in this picture were again probably working in the downtown main library, again in the early 1930s. And this is the circulation desk, I believe, at the Bellevue Library, but it's hard to be sure. Again, in the early 1930s. Now, another thing about the Carnegie Libraries, especially at the Bellevue Library, is children were very welcome. In the early days before libraries became so common, thanks to the Carnegie Library Foundation, children under 12 were often banned from libraries. They were not welcome. But almost every single Carnegie Library had a special reading room for children, as does the Bellevue Library. Here's a story time in around the 1960s. This welcoming of children and fostering of children in libraries was tapping into a new information about child psychology and child development that delineated scientifically established stages of child development. So this was something that was nurtured in libraries. Whoops, hold on. Here we go. So children's rooms were seen as an opportunity for maximizing the library's positive impact on the child. And overseeing this mighty tool of influence then raised the importance of exposing children to books and raised the status of librarians with expertise dedicated to children. So the branch librarian in Bellevue Library had one librarian assigned to the role of addressing the children's needs. And today, in 2024, the Bellevue Branch Library, about half of the items in circulation there are juvenile material. So this legacy has definitely continued. Libraries these days are not just places to check out books, they're also community centers. This is an author visit at the Bellevue Branch Library. There are community gatherings. This is just a month or so ago. Friends of Anderson Park had a short story contest, and we had a reading at the library of the three winners. Their stories were read aloud in the Bellevue Library. And this is a literary gathering called the Circulation Circle. This is in I guess you would call the backyard of the Bellevue Branch Library, which is now a parking lot. The library is also an after-school hangout. These are kids going up the front steps of the library. These are Boy Scouts presumably doing some volunteer work or earning a badge, I'm not sure, on the front steps of the library. And, the plaza has become a public space for music and book sales and all sorts of things. Also a good place to catch up on a little gossip if you're quiet. Now, preservation. The Carnegie Corporation built 36 libraries in New Jersey between 1900 and 1917. All but 7 still stand and 16 still function as libraries, but not all of these have fared well over the years. This is the Caldwell Library, which was a victim of Hurricane Ida in 2021, and it may be demolished. The architectural elements in some of these libraries have been destroyed. Additions and renovations have been ham-fisted at some, and some buildings, as I mentioned, have been outright demolished. This one, which you saw earlier, is gone. This was Riverside, California. This one, the Montclair's first Carnegie Library, has fortunately weathered the years fairly well and has been adaptively reused as part of the Unitarian Universalist Church. In Vineland, New Jersey, the Carnegie Library is now a senior center. In East Orange, it houses a municipal court. In Union City, it's a community cultural center, and in Westfield, it's a retail complex. So the ones that have not continued on as libraries, many of them have continued on as something else. In Thief River Falls, Minnesota, the library has been adaptively reused as city cultural offices. This library happened to open the same year as the Bellevue branch, 1914. In Hespeler, Ontario, the historic library is encased in modern glass, like a ship inside a bottle. That's a pretty radical alteration, but they did preserve the library inside that glass encasement. Now, the Bellevue Branch Library is on the National Register of Historic Places. It was added to that registry in 1986. It's extremely fortunate in that its architectural integrity is largely intact, and it still fulfills its original purpose as a library. It's one of 12 Carnegie libraries in New Jersey that are on the National Register of Historic Places. And over the years, only a few significant features of its architecture have been lost. One of them is that iron grilled door we talked about earlier, which you can see here in the architectural drawing. Oddly enough, these 2 lamps on either side of the entranceway were stolen in the dead of night in 1993, never to be found again. And they were replaced by replicas. These are the replacements. Over the years, there have been 3 styles of ceiling lights. This is the original one, a 1950s version, and the ones we have now. The backyard that you see here, the grassy back area, is now a paved parking lot. These perimeter hedges are gone, but there is now a plan to restore them along with improving the drainage on the grounds. So that may happen in a year or so. And over the years, there have been, since actually the 1970s, there have been 3 proposals to just outright closed the Bellevue Branch Library to save money. It was in fact closed for 6 months in 2011, and reopened only after community efforts and creation of the Friends of the Bellevue Avenue Library, which advocated very strongly on its behalf. This is that reopening date ceremony. Also over the years, since 2014, since the library's centennial, there have been proposals for ways that the library can, number one, be made handicapped accessible, and number two, expand. This was one proposal that was made in 2014. This is a very different proposal made in 2018. It would take millions of dollars, of course, to make either of these proposals a reality. But these visions do spark a discussion about what makes the library special and how we can best ensure a vibrant future for it, while also protecting and preserving its architectural integrity. The library is constantly and continually redefining itself. Unlike in 1914, you can now check out more than books. You can get seeds from the seed library, or you can borrow all manner of items from what they call the Library of Things, which includes everything from a knife sharpener, for instance, or a telescope. It's a community space, it's an event space, and it serves all sorts of other functions. But the point is that libraries evolve with their communities, as this one has now for 110 years. So I think I'll end there, and if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Lisanne. I'm going to just start the ball rolling because I already put it in the chat. I want to know a little bit more about the fumigator. I did not realize that was at the branch. Do you know when that was actively used until?
I do not know. It appears you can find it mentioned one or two times in the newspaper. But when it was removed, I don't know. Now, if you go down there, it's just kind of like a closet.
Right.
And I don't even know whether it was truly effective or not. But, as people that have recently lived through COVID, we can certainly understand the fear and the desire to want to, fumigate or whatever, sterilize these books that are going from household to household.
It's fascinating. I'm going to have to go check that out. So interesting. We do have a question in the chat. And by the way, if anyone has questions, you're welcome to either unmute, or if you put them in the chat, I'll read them for you. So one is, had Mount Hebron School been built by the time the Bellevue Library was built?
Oh, Helen, maybe you can help me out on this. And there have been several iterations of that school. I think not the school that's there now, but I do believe there was already a Mount Hebron built when this.
I happen to be looking at that information like right now while you were talking. I was looking at our bus tour information. I had that open here, and the first Mount Hebron School was built around 1827. So there was right there there was a school on the corner there of Norwood and Bellevue since the early 1800s. But yes, many different, very different looking than the one that's there, and the one that's there was I think in the late 1890s started to look like the school that we would recognize today, but then even that there were many additions built onto that.
Thanks, Helen. Lisanne? I'm also fascinated by the windows that had a built-in venting system. Was that new technology at the time? I saw the first time also hearing about that as well.
I'm not sure when the Austral windows were patented. I do think they were probably considered, state of the art at the time, but I don't know what year they were patented. I don't know if they had been around for 5 years, 10 years, but I think they were considered nifty at the time.
Sure, I want them for my house. So.
They seem like if you had to have that kind of height, they seem like they would be really sort of earmarked for more civic buildings that had this kind of height,
Sure.
Courthouses or libraries or whatever. But yeah, they're pretty cool.
Yeah. Really interesting.
Well, and I'm glad that the township, spent the money to restore them. It really
Mhm.
makes a difference to have good airtight functioning windows.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, anyone feel free to unmute or use the chat for more questions. Great. So we have another from Mark Porter. Did the Carnegie Foundation place any mandates on the libraries it funded? For instance, did it forbid the sale of the structure it funded or place restrictions on their use? That's a good question.
That is a good question. I'm sure someone can answer that. I don't know off the top of my head. I mean, logic would say that they probably had some stipulation in the contract that you can't just, have them build a building and then 5 years later turn it around and sell it. I would think so, but I can't speak to that authoritatively.
What city was that the library that's sort of encased in glass? Where was that one again?
Hold on, let me double check so I give you the right answer. That was in Ontario, Canada, a town called Hespeler, Hespeler, Ontario.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's so weird.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to physically visit that. I've only seen photos.
Uh-huh.
Very fascinating. Can you show the rendering of the 2014 expansion proposal? Or may I guess go back to that in the slides?
Sure. This is the 2018 proposal. This is the 2014 proposal. And I just want to be clear, like these were just kind of thrown out there. There was not, they didn't formally apply to anyone to build them. These were just kind of ideas. They were generating ideas, exploring what this might look like, how it might work.
Lynching, our plans at the moment on the halt, Lisanne, from these ideas that were put out there?
I'm sorry, are they what?
Are the plans no longer in the works, or is the idea still
I
there?
mean, they were never if they were going to build something like this, they being the library or the township, or they would have to go to the state historic preservation office and all sorts of things. It never got to that point. It was just like ideation or whatever that term is people use.
Yeah.
They're just kind of, I mean, they obviously spent money to hire architects. So, it wasn't flippant, but they were just exploratory, I would say.
Interesting. A few more things came in the chat, so let me just scroll up to make sure I read these all. The Aries family that led the petition and met with Carnegie with Reverend Jackson built the house that was sold to Lackadair in 1924. Is that correct?
I believe so. I mean, I think there were, maybe two brothers, I'm not sure, with the same last name. One of them was a doctor, and I'm not sure who the other one was. I think there were two. And one of them was definitely lived in the house that's Lacordaire. And when you look at the petition, there's several people with that last name on the petition. And one of them was the driving force behind getting this branch library built. And they were very influential people in town at that time.
Rob is kindly pointing out to us, depending on where you're located in the US, New Jersey, New York, or Pennsylvania region, how you pronounce Carnegie might be different. I think actually we had that debate with one of our staff members who's from Pennsylvania. We say it the same. I don't know if Erin's still on, if she'll agree or disagree, but
We should
They say
probably,
Carnegie.
Carnegie, that's how you go, yeah.
well, we should probably go to Scotland and see how they pronounce it there.
Right. Get
Yeah.
the original.
Yeah.
But that is funny, even just short distances, just depending on what state and area you're in. Someone else is sharing, they were a member of the Friends group that worked ceaselessly to have it reopened after the sudden secretive closing, and will always be very proud of the community efforts, which continue to bear the fruit in a beautiful way. Thank you, Laura, for sharing that.
Yeah. There was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that went into getting that library reopened and doing a lot to keep it vibrant and alive and, the place that it is now.
And I appreciate you too, Lisanne, sharing about women in the workforce and how this became a more dominant field as well. So I enjoyed learning about that too. Any other questions or thoughts? Anyone's also welcome to unmute if you don't want to use the chat. A moment. Well, thank you so much, Lisanne. This was really fascinating. We truly appreciated it. We will put this whole presentation on our YouTube channel. So if anyone wants to share it with friends or anyone who missed it tonight, it will be available. And I think you inspired me to at least go and seek out the windows in the fumigator closet. So I will be making my trip next time I go past the branch. Really interesting. Thank you so much, truly.
Oh, my pleasure.
Lots of good new stuff in there, Lisanne, from the last,
Yeah.
you did this many years ago.
Yeah.
But you've updated it. It's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
And any